Good evening, everybody. So this is a really important night. Some of you were not born on 9/11. I remember where I was. I was sitting in my office, and it was a beautiful day like today. And so students were, and the doors were all open. We had screen doors. It was in a wonderful house that was built in 1899. We had screen doors, and students were coming in and out. And all of a sudden, everybody said, turn on the television, turn on the television, look at your computer. And we saw those planes go into the buildings. My daughter at the time was in elementary school. And so teachers didn't know what to do, and they showed that picture over and over all day. Well, she was just a little girl, and she thought that different planes were going in different buildings all day long. So by the time she got home, she and every other little child who had watched something like that, they were traumatized. I'll never forget my mother. When I was a senior in high school, I had a very strict mother. Oh, I thought she was awful. And on graduation night, we had a party, and the party was all night long. Well, my hateful, mean mother would only let me stay out till 3 o'clock in the morning, and I thought that was ridiculous. So I was having a little hissy fit, and my mother said, I don't have any sympathy. Do you know when I graduated from high school what we did? And I said, no, I guess your daddy wouldn't let you stay out all night either. And she said, well, no, he wouldn't, because we had walked as a class down to the train station in Chattanooga and put all our boys on the train to go to World War II. So these are the kinds of things that leave that indelible imprint on the brain. I hope you don't have a situation like that in your lifetime. Unfortunately, you probably will. I mean, we all do. But you're so fortunate tonight, even though this is a sad topic, a serious topic, you have 4 experts. And I will tell you this, whoever else in the country has a criminal justice program, and there are plenty, I would put our criminal justice program up against anybody's. And here's why. Somebody's clapping. We'll clap. We'll all clap to that. So when you teach, you know, you have to have a master's degree or you have to have a PhD. And the question from the student is, do you know anything about what you're actually doing? So I teach English, and I teach grammar, for example. So do I edit? Yep, I've edited about 200 books in my career. You want somebody who knows what they're doing. You have a team in Homeland Security and criminal justice who know exactly what they're doing. You have Dr. Mottola from NYPD Counterterrorism. You have Dr. Schoberl from the FBI and the CIA. You have retired Lieutenant Colonel Cochran Pruitt, retired from the military and has come to be with us. And then Dr. Scher, he's the one I always say, who knows what that guy did? I can't ever understand it. You have a team who has been there and done that and is now going to tell the story to you. So I'm so glad to see you here tonight. This will be so informative, and it's the kind of thing that as Americans, we've got to pay attention to. So good to see you. As I say, not a wonderful topic, but if you don't know, you can't do anything about it.
I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. I'd like to echo a little bit of what Dr. Cheatham said in the fact that, you know, I've worked with a lot of different people throughout my career, and I would say the best compliment that I could give to this department is the individuals that I have an opportunity to work with in this department are some of the most qualified people I've worked with throughout my entire career. I think you're going to get a special treat tonight with the level of expertise that is going to be brought to you guys tonight. I did have 2 kids in college. I got one that just graduated and one that's in college. And as a father, I would often look at some of their professors and the classes that they took and what their professors did. And because there's that magic search engine out there, Google, and then you can also go to their website and see what they did. And I think it's important not to have, particularly in this field, not to have a professor who just read a book and is going to regurgitate what they read, but have a professor who is reading the book and tell you what's right and what's wrong in there and what's real and what's not real based on their own personal experience, but also have the academic background to put it in check. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about terrorism on this day of 9/11 in remembrance of the tragic events of 9/11 that took place in this country. And we're going to get a historical perspective from Professor Pruitt in regards to the history of terrorism. Terrorism has been around for a millennia. It's not anything new. It's not a new term. People thousands of years ago were experiencing acts of terrorism, whether they use that terminology or not. And we'll talk a little bit about radicalization and polarization and what causes these individuals to mobilize and become what we call terrorists. And today I actually teach a class on international terrorism. Today we talked about, does that person consider themselves a terrorist, or do they consider themselves a martyr? You think about the Revolutionary War and the people who revolted against the British when we came here to the United States. We were branded as terrorists. But in our mind, we were not terrorists. We were revolutionaries. People are willing to die for their belief. It's a difficult thing to combat, and that's what we're faced with. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the terrorist attacks that have happened. Dr. Mottola will talk about his intimate knowledge and work in some of these investigations in New York and then across the country and globe. And then Dr. Scheer will close us with information on some of the emerging threats. Terrorism changes. It's dynamic. It's not the same. It's pretty fluid. We never know what's going to happen year to year and what's the new threats we're going to face with the emerging technologies. And then we'll do a quick Q&A. So at this time, I'd like to bring up Professor Pruitt. He's going to talk to us a little bit about that on the history of terrorism.
Thanks, everybody, for coming out. I feel privileged to be a small part of what we got going on tonight, and I want to share a little bit of a historical perspective. As you see, we'll get into it. But before I do that, I got to say that on September 11 each year, I am always reminded of my sweet grandmother. Her name was Janelle Cochran, and she's now passed away. And one of the reasons why I think about her is because she was one of the greatest listeners that I've ever known. And I was at her house in North Alabama, and I was on leave as a captain in the United States Army when 9/11 occurred. And I will never forget what her response was. I said, "Mama, you got to come see this." I was looking at it on TV. She was in the kitchen. She was washing dishes. And she stepped away for just a couple seconds, and she looked at the TV, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, sort of immediately recognized what was happening. And then she went back in the kitchen, and she started washing dishes again. I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 seconds later, she didn't stop. She just said to herself, within earshot of me, she said, and I'll never forget this because it was such simple and direct language, and it was her way of speaking, but it was also a very deep expression of her generation. And what she said was, "Well, I guess I'll start canning beans." That's what she said. And to me, those words are expressive of a time when our nation willingly accepted daily sacrifices such as rationing and other measures to show their commitment and resolve to stand firm in the face of the terrorism of Nazi Germany, and its allies. We might do well to remember the lessons of that generation as we deal with a host of our own problems, some of which we'll talk about tonight. But she might have also reminded me today, even as I prepared for this talk, of a simple, you might say even biblical notion, and that is that violence breeds violence. So with her in mind, I'd like to say that terrorism breeds terrorism. Historically, as has been mentioned, terrorism is as old as human conflict itself. Another way to say it is that terrorism is bullying at its most extreme. Violence is at the heart of terrorism, and it's the peculiar approach and application of violence that distinguishes it from other forms. If you ask the question, why be violent? For what purpose or for what end? Then you're pointing towards the motives of the terrorist, which are most often social or political, or both. Now, I should say on the front end, as I generally do, is that I want you to know that the basis of what I'm about to say is not my own work in primary sources, but rather the synthesis of the work of others, scholars like Walter Lacker, Tim Butcher, Philip Popper, Avram Yarmolinsky, John Keep, Orlando Figes, and others. I think it's important that we show our work, right? So I want to give credit where credit is due. One of the key markers of terrorism is what I call conspicuous violence. And to a set of anti-government anarchists who came to prominence in Europe in the 1870s, it was called, quote, propaganda by the deed, unquote. The idea was that violence should be used to send a message, and that the intended message was usually a social critique or a political statement. And the conspicuous violence was just the means of the delivery of that message. Implicit to these displays of violence was a deeper message also of coercion and intimidation. Most often the intended messages were therefore a variation on a theme. The theme suggests that without significant and rapid change to the current situation, more violence could be expected. It was a demonstrated threat. Conspicuous violence is about violence for display, and it was usually excessively big and bold violence, deliberately beyond the pale or taboo, committed on purpose to gain attention or notoriety. But I really don't want to quibble over the definitions of terrorism, either in its current usage or historically, because quite frankly, there are a ton of different definitions, and I'm not sure it really matters historically. What I would really like to do is to make an argument and to illustrate that with historical examples. I contend that the balance of history shows, first, that terrorism does not work. It's not a good strategy. It doesn't lead to the outcomes that are intended. Second, terrorism is an excellent predictor of only one key outcome, almost every time, which is retribution and repression. Third, terrorism most often inaugurates waves of other unintended consequences. And then fourth, terrorism, like many other forms of violence, is exploitative. And it's often exploitative of the individuals actually engaged in it. And in that way, victimization and radicalization go hand in hand. By way of brief illustration, I'd like to explore two historical examples. Both come from a long view of the early 20th century European history, which just happens to be part of a course that I'm instructing this semester. On June 28, 1914, a young man stood in front of a deli on a street corner in Sarajevo with a revolver in his pocket. He was a bit downtrodden and maybe also a bit relieved because the target had escaped. This young man was driven by a persistent angst over the conditions of the world, over the conditions of his homeland, and of the conditions of his people. He was remarkably egotistic and forthrightly ambitious. He was certainly willing to lay his life on the line to, quote, make a difference. He was committed to terrorism as an answer on both motives, to make a difference in the world and also to fulfill his need to be heard. So when the opportunity of a stalled car, which just happened to be on the same street corner where he stood, the car that just happened to carry the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, which was the target, and his wife Sophia, when that target presented itself, he took the opportunity. He pulled out his revolver and he shot them both at point blank range. And he was immediately captured by police and jailed. In his mind, he had made his difference and he had been heard. But it didn't turn out the way he intended. In fact, it didn't turn out the way his co-conspirators had intended either. In the shadowy world of terrorism, there is only very rarely perfect alignment, only very rarely even agreed upon outcomes, much less agreed upon motives. The reason why Gavrilo Princip was on the corner in the first place is because of the failure of their first attempt to assassinate their targets. His compatriots had thrown a bomb, as they had been taught, at the Archduke's moving car earlier that day. It had detonated in the wrong place, and his co-terrorists had either fled or been captured. But Gavrilo was a true believer and was committed. He was searching for another way when the car stalled in front of him. Now, many people know this story. It was one of those shots heard round the world. It turned out to be the catalyst or the spark that lit the match that started the fire of the largest and most destructive global human conflict in the world up to that point. What was known at the time as the Great War, what today we call World War I. The story most often not told, however, is the real conspiracy behind this act of terror. Gavrilo Princip was not a lone actor. In fact, he was radicalized, recruited, and exploited by a seasoned group of conspirators from the country next door. It was an instance of what today we call state-sponsored terrorism. So, for those of you who are conspiracy theorists out there, you might find this a little bit fun. For those of you in my classes who know that one of my favorite things to do is to debunk conspiracies, then you might be in for a little bit of a treat if that's your thing. Because I'm going to tell a little bit about the story of what a real conspiracy looks like. In neighboring Serbia, which is the geographic next door neighbor to Bosnia, a set of conspiracies had been in the works for decades. It was masterminded by a classic conspirator named Colonel Dragutin Dmitrievich with a nickname. His nickname was Apis, which for those of you who know Latin is Latin for the bee, because the bee can sting. In a complicated web of connections, Colonel Apis sat atop the Serbian military apparatus and two secretive organizations all at the same time. One was known as the Black Hand. They were the terroristic offshoot of an earlier organization known as Narodna Odbrana, or the People's Defense. It was the Black Hand that recognized the next door opportunity through a newly emergent group called the Young Bosnians. And that group frequently attended the nightlife scene in the Serbian capital of Belgrade. These young Bosnians were a group of dedicated young men, most of them ethnic Serbs, although they were from neighboring Bosnia. The Black Hand and the young Bosnians did not necessarily share the same vision for the region. The Serbian Black Hand looked to consolidate the region under the control of the Serbian government, while the young Bosnians looked to liberate Bosnia from the military occupation and recently imposed yoke of the Austrians. They were motivated by a process they called Pan-Slavism. Both were motivated by nationalistic notions, but their differences were significant. What they shared, however, was an equal disdain for the military oppression of the Austrian Empire that grew in the wake of the power vacuum created by the waning power of the Ottoman Empire in the region. What resulted was a convenient alliance that operated under the well-known dictum, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The short-term view of Colonel Appis's Serbian organizations was that the propaganda of the deed had produced a desired outcome in the successful assassination of the Austrian-leaning King of Serbia, and they then replaced that king by a more amenable and controllable one. They were therefore committed to terrorism as a valid approach to their geopolitical problems. And in this vein, the young Bosnians were suitable fodder for executing their vision of terrorism against Austria. So they equipped them, they trained them, and they secreted Gavrilo Princip and his group of assassins into neighboring Bosnia to get the job done. The problem was, this time, that the intended outcomes were not what they expected. All of the assassins were captured. All but one died in custody. After the assassination, anti-Serbian riots erupted across many of the provinces across the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Non-Serbs executed in cold blood many innocent people in the name of retribution. And in the areas of Bosnia-Herzegovina alone, the police stood aside as over 1,000 Serbian homes, villages, and shops were destroyed. And for a later conspiracy against another heir to another throne, Colonel Appice and the others in the Black Hand were placed on trial and executed later in June of 1917. As mentioned before, the assassination set off a chain of events that led to the deaths of millions on the battlefields of World War I. And although the Serbians were allied with the winners of the Great War, the aims of the Black Hand were not achieved. In the post-war period, Serbians were united with many other ethnicities in a political combination that would come to be known as Yugoslavia. The outcome was much closer to the pan-Slavic visions of the young Bosnians, but Yugoslavia didn't work out so well either. Bypassing the horrific repression of the communist dictator Tito's regime, within my own living memory were the catastrophic acts of terroristic genocide in the region pursued by the Serbian nationalist Slobodan Milosevic. And the unrest in that region continues. By way of another example from Eastern Europe, on 1 March 1887, on the 6-year anniversary of the assassination of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, a very intelligent 20-year-old man paced the sidewalks of the Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, the capital of Imperial Russia. In the year after his own father's death, he was something of a loner and had a very serious personality. He was highly articulate and ambitious, but he too was disillusioned with Russia and its ruling classes. While studying at the university, he became an activist, promoting the cause of the working class people. He had become convinced that although the reforms of the previous Tsar of Russia had granted freedom to the serfs and instituted other reforms, it was not enough, and it had come too late. Something had to be done. It had to be done now. Terrorism was his answer. So on that day, the special section of the St. Petersburg Police, or Okhrana, arrested the young man whose name was Alexander Ulyanov, known as Sasha. 3 of his 6 associates were carrying an array of homemade bombs. The bombs were designed with shrapnel and poison to be thrown into the open car of Tsar Alexander III. It was well known that the Tsar regularly traveled through the Nevsky Prospect Road, coming to and from his favorite residence in St. Petersburg, the Anichkov Palace. Sasha's small circle of would-be assassins were a more extreme offshoot of an earlier terrorist organization, the Narodnaya Volya, or People's Will. Calling on the legacies of the previous organization and seeking to capitalize on the reputation of that organization's terrorist past, this group called themselves the terrorist section of the People's Will, and they were even more rabidly committed to terrorism as the vehicle to bring about the overthrow of the Tsarist regime. This terrorist section was the brainchild of Sasha and a fellow hardline murderous student named Peter Shevarev. Building on the previous platform of the populist People's Will Party, they set about recruiting others to actually conduct the violence. Their fruitful harvest came directly from the field of the disaffected youth. The three who were designated to actually throw the bombs were also seemingly solitary figures whose lives seemed plagued by a series of repeated misfortunes. They had been victimized by circumstances and were radicalized into the vision of the People's Will agenda. Although violence had never been ruled out in previous versions of the People's Will organization, there had been a heated discussion about its usefulness. The party had been factionalized itself over that approach. Some thought that propaganda and good works would turn the hearts and the minds of the people towards a democratic overturning of the Tsarist regime. Others thought that the people could never be persuaded by reason alone, but that it would take forthright action and conspicuous violence to make it happen, and to make it happen now. Building on a Russian variation of Darwinism, the idea was that the responsibility of those who had the intellectual tools to imagine a different world, they also had the responsibility to take action. It would take a vanguard of committed martyrs to pave the way. In the words of one such person, quote, "History moves terribly slowly. We must give it a push," unquote. In the words of another, quote, "Carthage must be destroyed," unquote, with Carthage serving as the metaphor for the Tsarist regime in Russia. It's important to note here that the People's Will Party did not have the support of the people. They just claimed to be the vanguard of a set of ideas that should be the will of the people. It was visionary in their view. The power of conspicuous violence would motivate the people to their perspective as they saw it. As it turns out, it didn't work out so well. All 6 conspirators were captured. 5 of them, including Sasha, were hanged publicly about 20 miles east of St. Petersburg. The arrests motivated the secret police to begin another wave of repressive measures designed to destroy the organization for the 3rd time and to infiltrate its ranks with turncoats and informers. It would take another 25 years for similarly minded groups to return to those ideas. The most prominent of those to return to Sasha's ideas were his brother, known to history as Lenin, the early leader of the Communist Party that would use violence and a coup d'etat to bring about the Soviet Union. Further, Lenin's protege, Stalin, would go on to be one of the cruelest dictators the world has ever known, whose communist ideas would bring about a cruel famine and many other atrocities that would kill millions, the greatest victims of which were the peasants and the industrial workers, which the previous People's Will Party had been trying to champion all along. The Tsar had been replaced by another. And this Tsar was one that used their language and rhetoric to create a regime even more repressive than the first. And the legacies of that regime are still playing out in Ukraine today. These 2 examples, one of state-sponsored terrorism and the other of homegrown terrorism, serve as a poignant reminder. And that's violence breeds violence, and the consequences are often not what was intended. As we pause today to remember the sacrifices of those innocents and first responders who lost their lives in the tragic events of September 11, 2001, let us try to remember that they lost them because of the misguided views of a group of terrorists. Let us also try to remember that violence is not the answer in our own world. It's not the answer in our own lives, and it's not the answer within our own country. We might do well to be reminded of the unintended consequences of violence and that there are more constructive ways to be heard. we might also do well to be reminded that the best advice may be what someone close to me reminded me of very recently. And that is, maybe it's not about you being heard at all, but rather you being willing to listen. Thank you very much.
Interesting perspectives. One thing that we can be certain of is that without polarization, without radicalization and ideologies, then there is no acts of terrorism, because terrorism is not a simple act of uncalculated violence. Terrorism is a calculated violence that is influenced by polarization and radicalization. And a lot of you will be saying to yourselves, hey, Showboro, what is radicalization? Because shortly after 9/11, Showboro was saying, hey, what is radicalization? So was everyone else. The term was extremely new to people who worked in the counterterrorism realm. No one fully understood what exactly radicalization meant. Of course, now I don't know if this clicker's working. There we go. All right. So one of the most defining features when we look at terrorism is how terrorism evolves. It evolves with the same violence, the same gruesome attacks. I remember when the Islamic State was carrying out beheadings and placing people's heads on sticks. And people would ask me, what do you think about that? That is just like archaic, but yet the violence is so real. And I'm like, this is nothing new. What is new is YouTube. What is new is social media. But to place someone's head on a stick to demonstrate acts of violence is something as old as time. The challenge for us now, as we start evolving into terrorism, is not what we are concerned about, a mass radicalization or group radicalization, but an isolation of radicalization as the world becomes more polarized and radicalized as we move. At no point in time that I've worked counterterrorism have I seen a more polarized society, whereas Cochran had just brought up the fact, Professor Pruitt had brought up the fact that maybe it's not about our voices being heard, but about our ability to listen. And it seems that we as society have neglected to realize that we can listen and still debate without engaging in polarization and violence, which we're starting to see. The threat landscape that we envision going forward for counterterrorism is certainly one that we see will become more violent, more unpredictable in nature, particularly as we see these groups fragment. One of the biggest concerns for us now and for counterterrorism analysts is what we like to refer to as the extreme right or the extreme left. For the past 2 decades, counterterrorism has been brought into focus about jihad, Islamic extremism, and we've really neglected to focus on what's right here at home and what's also percolating in Europe and across the globe. And it's a different ideology. So when we talk about radicalization, I want to make sure we're not talking about just Islamic extremism. We are talking about people who are convinced and willing to carry out acts of violence as a means to carry off their belief. One of the biggest things that we are concerned with right now as we move forward is this post-organizational violence, this post-organizational radicalization. These groups that are what we would define as leaderless per se, as we start seeing these groups fragment across the United States and across the European continent, and then also too in countries that we no longer have eyes and ears in, such as Afghanistan, where terrorist organizations are not only able to recruit but also train young men and young women. And that's right, I said young women, because we're starting to see 1 in 4 terrorists now becoming women, females, in that nature. So when we talk about radicalization, we know that there's a puzzle for this. We know that there's a system for this. And we know that this is different, that people become radicalized for different reasons. Men and women do not become radicalized the same way and for the same reasons. And it's more of not a cookie cutter approach. We know that the radicalization process is more ingredient based. It's more variables. And different variables put together can increasingly elevate someone's risk factors to become radicalized. And I know some of you are thinking to yourself, why are we talking about radicalization? I thought the lecture was on terrorism. Well, there is no such thing as terrorism without radicalization, because these individuals are radicalized who carry out these attacks. When people are willing to die for their belief, regardless of religion, then those individuals are in a position to justify what they carry out, to justify the actions that they take forth. So this is a pathway, if you say, to extremism. When we look at it, and we look at the term, the concept, radicalization, it's like what you believe, what you actually believe that you can do to further the cause, to further your belief, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's religious. And we'll talk about some of these steps briefly before we get into this part. So what are some of the factors that contribute to this? We know that there are personal factors that motivate people to become radicalized. We know that there are group factors that can correlate with people becoming radicalized. We also know that there are societal factors, psychological factors. All of these factors, not just one single factor, can radicalize somebody, but a multitude of factors, a multitude of variables, a multitude of ingredients, if you will, elevate individuals to become radicalized, elevate them to have an ideology that they're willing to die for their belief. Personal needs, for example. How many people in here, and I've said this in my class before, feel that personal significance is important to them? If it wasn't, there wouldn't be a like button on your Instagram, right? There wouldn't be a like button on your Facebook. Personal significance is important to all of us, particularly those who might be marginalized in society, those who might be looking for something or looking to belong to something. These are the individuals who are targeted when we look at radicalization. Those who seek a sense of power, who might want to be in a position of power, who otherwise may not be in that position or have never held a position of power throughout their lives. These are people who are easily succumbed to radicalization. Those who may have frustrations with society, those who might suffer from poverty, socioeconomic status. I always tell people poverty is such a dirty word. In 2023, we can eradicate everything but poverty near. We found a COVID vaccine in 6 months, but we still can't eradicate poverty. But it's still a driving factor when we look at several different things such as crime, terrorism, and radicalization. Violent extremist groups use this radicalization or this process, because that's what it is. It's a process. It's not an event in itself. They use it to provide themselves with a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of belonging. And the key thing, it's their avenue for revenge to take against others who may not believe. And remember what Professor Pruitt said earlier in regards to talking and listening. These individuals don't want to hear what you have to say because to them, they can't hear it. They're so polarized to this side that they can't see your belief on this side. Collective identity, defining oneself. Radicalization allows that person to define themselves as to what they believe they should be. They don't care about what you believe they should be. They care about what they believe. The radicalization process allows these individuals that opportunity to define who they want to be. A source of rage. When we look at Moner here, Moner was a typical teenager. As you can see, his progression throughout the years was a typical teenager that grew up in Fort Vero Beach, Florida. And he was saddened by some of the videos that he saw on YouTube about Muslim communities being bombed overseas and the United States retaliating against the Muslims in some of the lands that had participated in the September 11th attacks and those who might harbor the terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. So he decided that he would start converting to what we call radical Islam. He was converted online by a charismatic cleric named Anwar al-Awlaki. He began going to a mosque that had a charismatic cleric. And he fit the perfect demographic for a person that could easily be radicalized. He was against U.S. policy. He was against U.S. occupation in the Middle East. He felt sorry for those, but he was also an outsider at school. He was bullied. He wanted a place where he could belong. He was marginalized. He was looking for a sense of identity. He was looking for a sense of existence. He was looking for someone to hit that like button for him. And this gave him that like button, okay? And it says deceased because he wore a vest, a bomb, and then drove a vehicle packed with explosives and fertilizer into a city where he ended up killing 10,000 people. Interpretive framework. The one thing that ideology does is ideology really is the crutch. It's the common denominator that justifies the violence. When we look at what ideology does for radicalization, is we know that it really justifies the existence of violence and that it's okay for you to carry out that attack because that's what it does. Once we've come to the fact where we are indoctrinated in the cause, we are indoctrinated in what we believe we are doing is right, it quickly shifts from that indoctrination phase to what we often refer to as the jihadization or mobilization phase. And since we're broadly stroking radicalization across all extremes, both Islamic and right-wing, left-wing extremism, we can say that mobilization is the stage where that person now is convinced that what I need to do is violence of action in order for me, for my group, for us to make a difference. And that's the moment in time that's hard to discern, to look at a person and say that person is getting ready to carry out a terrorist attack. No one is a mind reader. No one knows when that's going to happen. But we do know that it takes one dynamic event for the mobilization process to happen. The process by which the person knows it is time to take action. Inciting violence, supporting violence, or preparing to engage in violence. You don't have to actually take place or participate in a terrorist attack to be a part of the process. You can support it. You can incite it. You can fund it. These people are still true believers and still involved in it. And this is a way for them to mobilize their actions. We know that one of the things that we must do when we talk about radicalization is, like any disease, if you want to look at it like that, is how do we combat these narratives? And this is one of the things that we struggle with from a counterterrorism perspective, is how we as counterterrorism officials look at countering the narrative of creating the hysteria, the Hollywood-esque propaganda that is being put out there by extremist movements and how we squash that narrative through what we call de-radicalization programming. Many countries in existence today have de-radicalization programs. The United States does not. It's changing the way someone thinks, changing the way that they believe, which is difficult to do. Think about how difficult it would be for someone to change the way that you think. So keep in mind, not everyone who commits terrorism is radicalized through the radicalization process. Radicalization really is your change in beliefs in what you have to do in order to make a difference, whether it's social, political, or religious, right? Not everyone who radicalizes will actually mobilize. A lot of people will go through the radicalization process and will stop before they actually carry out attack. I've interviewed several people before who went through the process, and I was like, why didn't you? And they were like, I just wasn't ready to strap a bomb to my chest and blow things up. I was very indoctrinated. I very much believed in the cause. I just wasn't ready to die. They were a jilted believer and not a true believer if they were not ready to die for their belief, for their cause. Mobilization is an active support for terrorism, and many mobilization factors are there. We wouldn't see them, law enforcement wouldn't see them, but those factors, those behaviors that people exhibit, close family, friends, spouses, sisters, brothers, they would see them. Dr. Mottola is going to talk to us a little bit about terrorist attacks, the individuals who have carried out these attacks, and some of the biggest attacks we've had here.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right.
The State Department.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today, we've had a national tragedy.
I know one of us sounded like a missile.
The confusion.
Imagine the terror and the carnage.
I'm going to stick the phone out the window and see if you can hear the warning.
Los Angeles is on a state of tactical alert.
And to conduct a full-scale investigation.
This is essentially an organization waging war on the United States.
To hunt down.
Hole in one of the buildings. It looks like the one with the antenna, and there's black smoke just pouring out of the hole.
And to find those folks who committed this act.
There are bloody shoes. People are weeping coming out of there.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
This is an attack upon the core values of this country and who we are, and we will respond with a single voice. We will line up behind our commander-in-chief. We will take every step that is necessary.
May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
American policing has changed forever. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask everybody just to bow your head for a moment of silence for the victims of 9/11. Thank you so much. Every year or so, I do a 9/11 presentation to revitalize or to bring education to some of you that were not even born at that time or might not have seen or been part of it. I was there, I saw the carnage, I saw the destruction, and then I had to be involved in the rebuilding process. It is something that, at the time, you don't even realize you're part of history. You don't know you're part of history. It's just beginning. And we're all running around. We're reacting at that time. I was stuck in the tunnel when the second building collapsed. As we got out of the tunnel, I grabbed that mask from that vehicle right there. But you could just see the cloud in the background. And although people have mentioned to me, and I know what it is, that there's dust particles in the air and everything, several people have said to me about the orbs on the photo, and that photo might actually contain souls of people that were perished that day. And I never thought of it that way until that person spoke to me. Afterwards, it was just digging and digging and looking for body parts. Because at that point, we knew there were not many survivors, if they could survive. So what we did is we began to just rebuild, right? Cleaning out, looking for those, and giving families something that they could have to bury. It was a tough time, and every year, I mentioned to our crew, doing this presentation takes a toll on me. I was there, and I have to relive it every year. Every morning, 9 a.m., 8 a.m., I really relive it all over again. As of now, there were 343 New York City firefighters that were killed that day. 37 Port Authority police officers and 23 New York City police officers killed on 11 that morning. A total of almost 3,000 people were killed in New York City, the Pentagon, and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, for those heroes who took down the plane. 2 days ago, 2 new victims were identified, a man and woman, through DNA. All right? To give some closure to 2 more families. 2 days ago. We're 22 years later, and we're still finding body parts and DNA and identifying people. We still have not identified 40% of the victims from 9/11. Imagine being a loved one and having nothing to bury. You have nothing. You just have hope that one day they'll find something. Post 9/11, we've had 2,000 plus first responders and civilians who have passed away from 9/11 related injuries. 2,000 plus. Right? And the reason why I have plus is because they're still working on DNA and who to identify and how to identify. So long after, 22 years after, we're now from almost 3,000 to 5,000 victims of 9/11. And it's a struggle every year for victims and for families to understand what led to this. How did we get here? Well, we do know, obviously, the faces of terror, the 19 terrorists that were involved in hijacking the aircraft. And we also know, obviously, Osama bin Laden was part of the planning and attack. Dr. Sherbo was part of an investigation to go after the mastermind of it. He was killed on May 2nd in 2011 by Navy SEAL and Special Forces. We know that, right? Kind of a stepping stone. We're kind of like moving forward, right? We want to take things and we want to move forward. How are we going to rebuild? Tower has been rebuilt, right? I waited until that day to retire, when I could sign my name on the rooftop of the new World Trade Center, and I said it's time to go. But let's talk about some things that people don't know. It varies. If you go into Google and you look at how many terrorist incidents attacks have been related, or it goes into the 600-700s, right? What I know of my investigations, and part of the investigations that I was involved in, is about 147 of mine that I know. that I say these were. You might never hear of some of the investigations. Right? We might foil an attack, you won't even know about it, because they might be signing that person up as a confidential informant, right, to work a case. They'll never bring up an attack that they foiled every time, unless there is an indictment brought about, a federal indictment. Terrorist incidents in New York, there's about 14 since 9/11. Unsuccessful terrorist plots, there's about 52. That number is way more. Because obviously, right, statistically, I just mentioned we sign people up as confidential informants. Those cases won't be out there. We won't let people know where that is. So there is probably more foiled plots than that. Unsuccessful attacks in New York City since 9/11 has been 10. Right, 10. And like I said, terrorist attacks are measured differently. Groups, you got to remember injuries, thwarted attacks. There are deaths. We measure by deaths. Some you'll see, hey, you know, there's only been this many deaths by a terrorist attack. Well, has there been any injuries? Was it a thwarted attack? That all calculates differently. That changes all the statistical analysis, right? So that kind of leads us to post 9/11 and where we're at. Where have we gone from the day that those buildings came down 22 years ago to where we are today? Okay, so we know we have foreign terrorists, we have domestic terrorists. Currently, right now, domestic terrorists seem to be our biggest problem in the United States, domestic terrorism. Dr. Scher is going to talk about that more. Successful attacks, thwarted attacks, cities that have been targeted are something that we look at. What cities? Where could the next attack come from? Where could the next attack come from? I can tell you this, in 2015, I guarantee you Chattanooga had no idea that 4 Marines were going to be killed in a terrorist attack, right? How about in 2021? Nashville, Christmas Day, a bombing right in Nashville. I bet you we didn't know about that. We weren't planning that. And in 2023, our school shooting right here in Nashville. We don't know where they're going to come from, right? They could be in any city. The worst thing I've ever heard an agency say as I travel the country working for the NYPD conducting counterterrorism is, we're not as big as a target as you are. That's the worst mistake anybody could say. That's the worst mistake. So when we look at this and we say right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, terrorists, okay, religious terrorists, groups with missions, right? Where does that calculate for us and my CJ majors that are here, that are going to go on and be our next chapter, right? You're going to thwart the next attack. Where does that take us? All right. When people are charged or indicted, right, for terrorist crimes, 81% are citizens or permanent residents, right here in the United States, 81%. So now we have to gear our ideologies and our teachings to our local law enforcement agencies and our federal agencies to look for that. Also, 10% visa, immigrants, other, etc. People that come from other countries. And then finally, there's actually 9% that are completely unknown. We don't know where they originate from. They committed an attack, but we're not sure where they commit, because we do have lone actors that will take on action on their own, right? And if they, I'm being honest, blow themselves up, what do we have to show for it? How can we prove it if there is no manifest? There's no manifesto, if there's no video that comes out afterwards, if no, ISIS is not saying they're one of us. We have no idea where they're coming from. So there could be unknown origin. So when you think about these things, right, we kind of say, all right, how do we police this? How is it that we can and do that? Well, during the investigations that I've been involved in, I'm going to mention a few that I have actually been involved in, cases that I've actually worked. Because either we were connected through federal work on counterterrorism, and it had a nexus to New York that connected us to another city, we started an investigation. And how we did that is we started noticing that when someone committed a violent act, either their manifest, their online chatter, their online work, their social media, led us into a direction of an investigation. Jermaine was a suicide bomber in the London Underground. There was 4 suicide bombers. But stuff from Jermaine had provided that we were able to make connection to. We had Richard Reed, the shoe bomber in 2001, right after 9/11, was going to blow himself up on a plane, right? That's why everybody has to take their shoes off before they get on a plane. That's why you're not allowed to have a certain amount of liquid on a plane. Umar Farouk, all right, was our underwear bomber in 2009. That's part of the liquid. That's why you aren't allowed to bring a certain amount of liquid on, right? Had liquid in his underwear and ended up setting himself on fire. But there was a connection to all these, right? And Faisal Shahzad, unsuccessful attack, car bomb in Times Square, a case I worked within the Intelligence Bureau. All these cases kept coming around to one name that appeared as an influence. One name. Abdullah El Faisal. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. He was considered a very influential English-speaking cleric. He was Jamaica-born Muslim, converted in England in 1990s, gave fiery speeches that included things like, learn how to shoot a gun, learn how to build an IED. The way forward is not the bulletin, it's the bullet. And he was spewing this in England and trying to elicit people to come into their world. He was deported. He actually served 9 years he was to serve 9 years actually in England, and ended up, for good behavior, getting out early, and was deported back to Jamaica. Less than a 9-year sentence. He was arrested because of his hatred and solicitation of murder of Jews, Americans, and Hindus. So they sent him to Jamaica. He began in Jamaica publishing hateful preachings and speeches and pushing his violent extremism online, amassing a global network. Okay? His connection were to all those bombers that you just saw. He inspired them, just as Dr. Sherbo said, all right? Just as Dr. Pruitt said. He inspired them. What we have nowadays, which Dr. Sherbo brought about, is we have that connection online. I can be in a foreign country somewhere in the most remote location, but if I have the internet, I can reach every one of you right here in Tennessee. So from Jamaica, he started. He also was connected to Zakari Musari, one of the 9/11 bombers, pilots, who missed the plane and ended up getting arrested. So we're talking about five terrorists that they can knowingly connect him to. We had, prior to me retiring, we had an NYPD undercover female that started a case by talking to him online, because that's where he was communicating. And what she did is she built trust with him and started discussing this with him. So the correspondence went on for several months, to the point that we actually flew her to Jordan so that her cell phone can be picked up on cell towers in Jordan. Then we sent her over to Abu Dhabi so she would have a connection in Abu Dhabi. All this to keep him talking, because we're trying to find the connection. Well, he put her in touch with an ISIS fighter from Syria who was willing to get her into the country to fight for the country. Now, we have an undercover police officer, right, who is being indoctrinated and radicalized to go and fight in Syria with ISIS, just like that, online. No one-on-one, no face-to-face, no personal. He never stepped foot in the United States, but yet he was able to reach her. Never stepped foot in the United States. England to Jamaica, stayed in Jamaica, and continued to push his indoctrination from there. So what we did in 2017, that's my chief right there in the blue shirt, working with the Jamaica police, we actually flew down and arrested him on the first state charge of terrorism. No local law enforcement agency has ever charged someone out of state, out of country, flown there, arrested him, and extradited him back to the United States to face state charges for terrorism. It's the first time ever been done. That's why when I speak in my classes to my students and I say, you're going to make change, there's change. That's change. You're our future to make change. Many of you could be involved in a case similar to this. Just now in 2023, just this past March, he was charged, he was indicted, and he had been charged and found guilty of state terrorism charges and will be serving 20 years in the United States in a state facility. All right? It's kind of a way to show that in post 9/11, how do we, as local law enforcement, still need to have that connection to policing terrorism? How do we have that connection, right? Normally it's a federal organization, for federal job, but we have to all work together. I actually said in my class today, I said, you know, no police department can fight crime without a community. It's absolutely impossible. You need a community, right? You need your community. You need to be there. 16 Islamic extremist attacks resulting in death since 9/11. 3 were Pakistani descent, 3 African Americans, 3 U.S. citizens that were white converts, 2 from Russia, which I'm going to go over. I want to speak about 2 from Russia. U.S. citizen from Palestinian descent, Afghanistan, Egypt, Uzbekistan, and 1 Saudi U.S. Air Force officer that was here learning to fly in the United States, but actually was working for ISIS, and in his class pulled out a firearm. He had applied for a hunting license and was permitted to get a hunting license knowing that he can get hands on a firearm, brought it into class and shot and killed 4 airmen. It's where we're going now to understand. So I want to talk about the 2 from Russia. April 15th, we had the Boston bombing, right? 2013. I was driving in my car in Manhattan. I get a phone call from the chief. We need you. You got your bag with you? No, I don't have my bag with me. That's my bag to wear clothes and such. All right, we need you on the road. There was a bombing in Boston. We need you there now. With nothing on, no luggage. I just turned the car around in Manhattan and drove right straight to Boston. Within 3 hours, I was on scene in Boston. The bombs were detonated with cell phones, right, in backpacks. We didn't have much information, didn't know what was going on. We knew that they were placed near the end of the marathon because I could see they're right there, and ended up killing 3, 2 adult females and an 8-year-old boy, right? And then injuries were about 282. 282 people, 16 of them lost limbs in a bombing. So injuries can be, everybody always wants to say deaths. Oh, 3. What about those 282 people? You think they'll, and it'd be the same, you think they'll go to a marathon and feel comfortable being a marathon again? It's PTSD. You can see over here on the side our two subjects were identified through surveillance and photos. That's all we had. I remember standing there when they hand me the photos and they say, we got to find these two. Let's start putting it out. So I'm sending it back to New York. I'm sending it back to the command. I'm notifying the commissioner what's happening. We got to find these two. Where are they going now? So here I am. This photo was taken by a photographer, you could see. But I was just telling the story a little while ago. This photo doesn't really show it. But see that black truck back there? That's the bomb squad. We were standing on the scene when they were trying to run away and escape. They were throwing pipe bombs at the police department, at the Boston Police. Well, we didn't know it at the time. We were standing right next to a pipe bomb. And one of the transit police officers said, I think that's a pipe bomb on the ground. And we literally were standing right near the pipe bomb. So we all backed out. We had to call the bomb squad in, and that was what was going on right there. And we were all discussing it. I just realized that I have more hair in that picture, so don't judge me. Starting to go. What did we have now? Okay, so a manhunt ensues, and we identified two subjects, Tamarin and Jahar. They're two brothers, one radicalized, both from Russia, okay? One radicalized, decided to radicalize his younger brother. His younger brother was very Americanized. Video games, going to college, half-y student, you know? Excuse my French. That slipped out, that one. They went back to their apartment, then they retrieved some IEDs and some guns, and they head out. Now they know they're found. It's all over the media. Their photos are there. They go to MIT, a college campus. They end up getting connected, meeting up with an MIT police officer, campus police officer, and assassinating him in his car to take his firearm. Because they know they're going to head out. Unbeknownst to us at the time, they're on their way to New York City, to Times Square, to finish what Faisal Shahzad was not able to do in Times Square. Wanted to blow up Times Square. So they figured they're going to take they're going to opportunity. So they got pipe bombs now, they got IEDs, they got firearms, and they're going to head out and they're going to go to New York City to shoot up Times Square and detonate explosives. We hear all this on the radio. We're all responding. We're all trying to help out Boston. We're getting the information there. Where are they? Ultimately, as a lot of people know, they ended up trying to hijack a Mercedes. They end up hijacking somebody, kidnapping him. They stop it to get gas because they're heading towards New York. He escapes, notifies the police. Car chase ensues. That's where those bombs, pipe bombs are being thrown. They're shooting at police officers. They get out. Ultimately, they get into a gun battle. The brother, Jahar, he actually, trying to escape with the car, drives over his brother and kills his brother, Tamerlan, and leaves. Then there's a manhunt for him, and he ends up being found in a boat. He just was sentenced to death, recent court case, and that he's going to... But this is all post 9/11. These two were radicalized by Inspire magazine, which is an online Al-Qaeda magazine. They learned how to build a bomb from a magazine put out by terrorist organizations that they continue to spew out on social media. They continue to push this material out. So we continue to look for this, right? This is what we continue. This is what I'm teaching in my classes right now, right? How do we move into the future of policing? We have several plots that have been thwarted, all right? Recently, 2002, FBI just arrested an Iraqi that was an asylum seeker and former Al-Qaeda fighter coming into the country. What his plan? He was going to smuggle 4 Iraqi nationals through the southern border. In doing that, he was looking to assassinate former President Bush, while he was telling people that he had already smuggled terrorists from Hezbollah across the southern border. He had already been involved in that. He had already gotten them into the country. This is reality. Okay? This is not propaganda. This is not political. This is reality. When we have to understand that there are ramifications for politics, I guess you could say, on local law enforcement and federal law enforcement and our military, right? Plots resulting injuries. Anybody hear this case, Bickford? 19 years, how many people are 19? How many people are 18? Okay, a lot of people in the room. 19 years old from Maine. He attacks 3 NYPD police officers just this past New Year's Eve at an entry control point using the machete. His intent was to get into Times Square with the machete and start hacking people in the center when the ball was dropping. So when everybody's looking up, he starts cutting people with the machete. That was what his intent was. What he didn't realize is that we have entry control points in Times Square. If anybody here wants to go to Times Square, trust me, it's not that fun. Watch it on television, all right? I've been there for years. It's a lot more fun on television. You're basically put into pens, but you have to go through entry control points to get to Times Square, and those first bins right below where the ball drops have already been spoken for by all the hotels in the area. So you can't even get to the bottom of the ball. You're going to be way, way up the block, way up the block. You probably won't even see the ball walk. You'll be watching it on your phone. So you go through all this. But those choke points, we check for weapons. When he saw that, he pulled out the machete at the choke point, and he started hacking at the officers, hurting them. Almost killed one. Radicalized online from the teachings of a radical Islamic cleric and a spiritual advisor to Al-Qaeda. This is just this past New Year's Eve. This past New Year's Eve. Devoted himself to a violent Islamic extremist. He really took it so to heart with his family that this is a picture of him with his brother, who's a Marine. He wanted his mother and his brothers to repent and join Islam, especially his brother, who he actually grew up with and deemed him as an enemy now in his manifest. Called his own brother an enemy of the state and of his beliefs. This is how far radicalized he had gotten, just online. The threat is still alive. Okay. The way we stop buildings from falling is we learn to believe that this can be stopped through your future actions. Okay? You are our future. We need you to take this seriously. That's why we're all here on 9/11 to present to you guys. It's true and dear to us. We've lived it. We've been there. And we want you all to take the baton and run with it. I'm going to pass the presentation on to Dr. Scher. I appreciate everybody listening. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, good evening. My name is Dan Scher, and my part of this is going to be talking a little bit about domestic terrorism and then some trends. So we're going to keep it very high level as we talk through some of these issues on domestic terrorism. So first, talk a little bit about definition. We're going to talk a little bit about these groups and statistics. As Dr. Mottola was saying, as we talk about statistics, and I put up some different graphs and some different charts and things, please don't look at the absolute numbers and think that that represents the actual reality of what's happening. There's a lot of different groups, there's a lot of different agencies that look at these different numbers and report. There's a lot of different statistics and a lot of different things that go into how many terrorist attacks we're talking and what kind of numbers we're talking about as far as prosecutions and the actual number of individuals. But the trends here that we're talking about remain the same. And then we're going to look at some current news and trends and how we actually combat domestic terrorism, and then we're going to look really briefly at some future issues. So I want to look at the definition. I know Dr. Pruitt said the definitions don't matter, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how many people we've prosecuted and how we do that under the domestic terrorism in the U.S. So I want to talk just briefly about it. So involves actions that are dangerous to human life, okay, violation of the criminal laws of the United States, or as Dr. Mottola just referenced, laws of a particular state. So states can prosecute for domestic terrorism now. And they have to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, try to influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion, or affect the conduct of the government, mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. And they have to happen in the United States. Okay? This definition of terrorism was broadened by the Patriot Act after 9/11. So prior to up to 9/11, the investigation of terrorism was a reactive investigation. Something happened, someone broke a law, we investigated, we prosecuted, we found everybody that was involved, we arrested, we put them in jail. After 9/11, we took a more proactive approach. And now as we're looking at our domestic terrorism, we're looking at these issues in today's society, we are very much looking to try to stop these things before they start. So obviously after 9/11, especially in the United States, international terrorism was kind of on everybody's mind. Makes sense, right? International terrorists came in, dropped the Twin Towers, and that was foremost in everyone's mind. That took up a lot of the oxygen in the room as we spoke about what kind of terrorism looks like, what happens in the United States, and who the major threat is. It didn't mean there weren't things happening in domestic terrorism. It wasn't an issue, but that took up a lot of the conversation, a lot of the oxygen we had. So investigations in cases, obviously after 9/11, they spiked both international and domestic terrorism in this country. But we found the domestic terrorism cases slowly leveled off and then decreased until about 2018 and 2019. And we saw a slow and then a massive uptick over the last few years with domestic terrorism. In today's society, we have a renewed focus on this domestic terrorism with that big uptick and, again, social media and some of these other issues. So this slide right here, what I want you to take away is you see the red numbers over here. This is different types of groups and what their ideologies are and their propensity for violence. Okay, so if you look at this, like I said, again, the numbers aren't necessarily as important, but if you look, white supremacist and nativist groups are far more likely to commit violent acts than nonviolent acts, followed secondly by jihadism. And then third, we get the sovereign citizen campaign and anarchists. And then you see some of these other ones. So they are up on the very violent end of the spectrum. We tend to see much more violent acts and violent attacks with those three. On the other end are environmental groups and animal rights groups. They tend to be much more nonviolent, and as we see the next slide, you'll see only a very small sliver of violent acts. I know you can't read all these, but just so you see, this is from 1948 to 2021, okay, so the last, 65, 70 years. So this is the total number of cases that we've had. So that top one and that third one, or I'm sorry, the number 1 and number 5, that's ISIS and Al-Qaeda, okay? We kind of know what those individuals are. That's been on the forefront of everyone's mind. Second one's the KKK. We've heard of those, okay? Especially here in Pulaski, Tennessee. They have a long history in this country. But what some other people don't seem to understand is sovereign citizens movement, which has been around, they're back in force as well. But then QAnon is number 4. Then you have Proud Boys, Boogaloo Movement, 3 Percenters. Some of these other new groups have surpassed these other groups that have been around for a long, long time, okay? So even though these groups are younger, we're seeing much more activity with these, and so they are in a whole lot of places. Go next slide. Maybe. There we go. All right, so this is briefly the domestic terrorist incidents by state. And this and the next slide are just to kind of show you data doesn't always tell the same story, okay? So you see the main suspects that you would suspect: New York, California, Florida, Virginia, Washington, D.C., okay? So some of your more populous states, some of your other states that you see in the news a lot with domestic terrorist incidents. But if you look just at 2022, okay, of the 183 attacks that happened in 2023, 78 of them were in Oregon. If you look at this map, Oregon doesn't have that big of a circle on there. So what happened in 2022 that caused Oregon to be number one by a long shot? Okay, you guys may not remember what was going on in Oregon. In the aftermath of the George Floyd's death, there were 100 days of protests in Oregon around Portland. And so we started off with social justice movements and protests, and protesting against George Floyd's death. Well, with protest in today's society especially, if you protest, guess what you also get? A counter-protest. And once you get those protests and those counter-protests, and this feeds right back into the radicalization and the communication and not listening and all those different things. Because when I'm protesting and you're protesting, I don't care what your beliefs are. If I'm protesting something and I have a belief and you show up with the opposite belief, all I care about is shouting louder than you. And it only takes a small spark for that to degrade violently. And that's eventually what happened in Portland. A far-left protester shot and killed a far-right protester. The details of that are muddied at best, but violence ensued. Far-right protesters then stormed the Capitol and actually breached the Capitol with the help of a lawmaker who was subsequently terminated. But they breached the Capitol in Portland. And as a result of those actions, you see this spike in terrorism cases in Oregon. Now, during fiscal year 2020, with the most populous state in the country, it's hard to believe that California only had one case. Okay? So again, what you see and how these things are prosecuted can vary greatly. And that also goes into the narrative being told, how things are prosecuted. There's a lot of different things that go into how many terrorism cases, where is there a hot spot, what's going on in the world today. So just because you see it on TV doesn't always mean it's the entire truth. Okay. All right, so these next two slides are just to give you a representation of, like I said, after 9/11, everybody was concerned about your international cases and your international terrorists. These are prosecutions at the federal level in the United States. Okay? So as you see here, spiked right after 9/11, then we see this up and down, but never less than 60 at any one time. Okay? Then we see this spike in 2020 and 2021. So this is for domestic. Now, international terrorism, which everybody spent most of the last 2 decades talking about, prosecutions look like this. So you see that spike right after 9/11, obviously, the Twin Towers and all of those different things that we had. But then you see it's almost done. It's almost gone here in 2020, 2021, compared with the domestic terrorism prosecutions. Okay? It's a fraction of those cases. So again, just because you see something more prominently online or you see it more prominently in whatever news media that you're looking at, there's more to this story as well. All right, so what does domestic terrorism look like today? Again, this is just to reinforce the points. So in 2010 to 2021, DHS reported 231 events. Just over a third of those were those ethnically and racially motivated groups, and those are by far the most lethal groups. Okay. Anti-government and anarchist groups, 32%, and then we have animal rights and environmental, and then abortion-related, which those two groups are two of the lesser violence, the lower level of violence, excuse me. And then those other single cause groups down here at the bottom. Now, these first two, these ethnically and racially motivated and those anti-government anarchists, those include groups from both left and right. Okay. So open investigations increased from about 2,000 in fiscal year 2013 to just over 9,000. That's over 4.5 times in those 8 years. Number of federal defendants, again, don't worry about the numbers, just see this massive spike in the years since 2018, 2019. Okay. So what do all those numbers mean? So if you guys have been paying attention to the news, I'm sure some of you have because we talked about them in class. So we've seen the cases around January 6th and the sentencing of the leaders of those groups. Okay? January 6th, whatever your political affiliation is, we had a number of people show up at the Capitol, and what may or may not have started off as a peaceful protest ended up breaching the Capitol, assaulting police officers, and creating massive acts of violence, vandalism, and destruction. Okay? Meets all of the criteria for domestic terrorism. Okay? We've had those leaders have been charged and sentenced to seditious insurrection, which is the overthrow of the government. Their entire purpose there on January 6th was to overthrow the results of the election. So Cop City prosecutions, for those of you that haven't heard of Cop City, it is a first responder training facility in Atlanta. Protesters against this believe it will further militarize the police forces and further disenfranchise at-risk populations in and around Atlanta. And so there have been a number of different protests. They've vandalized, they've assaulted police officers, and gone through a number of different iterations with their protests and counter-protests there. 61 individuals have been indicted for conspiracy at that facility, and 5 have been charged with domestic terrorism as well. So we see potential violence around elections. Again, with the January 6th that we just had, we have more threats of violence against elections coming up with the midterm elections, and then especially with the next presidential election. There's already rumors and rumblings of what that violence can look like. We've seen violence being threatened and even attempted against officials, against election officials, against officials in our legislative and judicial branches, and the electors jurors in the indictment against former President Trump and his cronies in Georgia. There's been, for whatever reason, their identities and information was posted online. And so there have been a number of threats against them by a number of groups as well. We see recruitment and radicalization online, which has been talked about, but that's something that in the domestic terrorism scene. So a lot of these recruitment and radicalization efforts that we see start with something really small. And we try to get individuals of like mind to start agreeing with us on little things. Okay? This is Tennessee, we're in the South. People watch football on the weekends, right? Okay? Everybody thinks we should fire Tannehill right now, right? Titans fans? Horrible game, get rid of him. Well, if you go online and you see that, or if you prefer the Alabama flavor than Alabama's performance over the weekend, you get in these chat groups and you see these individuals and they start talking more and more strongly about how badly things are and what kind of action needs to be taken. And it's little small things. And people that are looking to radicalize individuals, and football may not be the best example or best analog, but we find things that we have in common. And we get people to agree with us just a little bit. And we figure out which individuals agree with us the most. And those are the individuals we target for further conversations. And those conversations turn into an echo chamber. I'll say one thing and you'll agree with me. And then I'll say it louder and you'll agree with me more. And eventually we're both screaming something at each other, again, not listening, not paying attention, just knowing that we're right. And that's what social media gets you. Okay? We get this circle, and it just cycles and cycles and feeds on itself. And then we have threats against critical infrastructure is one of our next big topics, and we'll talk about them when we talk about cyber and some of our things moving forward. But we see a lot of threats against critical infrastructure in Oregon. That threat against critical infrastructure was one of the big challenges they had. They had 6 different substations that were targeted by extremists during that same 2020 time period. And at the time, Oregon was one of 16 states in the United States that did not have laws against domestic terrorist activity. Obviously, they had the laws against the criminal activity, but they did not have anything on the books for domestic terrorism. They closed that loophole in 2023. They passed that law in August of this year, and they now have a domestic terrorism law. So countering domestic terror, a lot of words on the slide. Okay, this is what the national strategy for countering domestic terrorism looks like as of 2021 and then updated again in 2023. So big things here, those SLTT, that state, local, tribal, and territorial, increasing the information sharing. So we've talked before about what that information sharing looks like. the need to keep people in the loop. Federal law enforcement agencies cannot do everything on their own. We need local law enforcement. We need other people to help us, okay? Whether it's the bombing over in Boston, where we have to mobilize everybody we can and try to get as much information to stop these individuals from attacking again, or trying to prevent these things from happening before they start. Engaging with your private sector, okay, for our critical infrastructure especially, more than 95% of our critical infrastructure is owned by private companies, which means the government can only secure it and only do so much. So we have to engage our private sector partners. So U.S. Treasury, one of the big things after 9/11, the Patriot Act came out with ways to follow the money with international terrorism. It's hard to conduct a large-scale attack if you can't fund it. Well, the U.S. Treasury just put out a tool for tracking the same thing and doing the same kind of activities and same kind of actions with domestic terrorism. So, talked a little bit before about these lone offenders. Lone offenders are one of the biggest threats that we have. These lone offenders or these small groups that may or may not be affiliated with a larger group. So they may not be part of a major terrorist group. They might be radicalized online. Okay? There's a lot of radicalization that helps in that online cycle. These individuals may not have ever had any contact with these individuals that makes them harder for us to track. All right, must confront the extremism no matter the ideology. Doesn't matter if it's left, right, or center. If you see this extremist ideology, if these things come up, we have got to find ways to confront them, to confront them. So prevent, disrupt, and deter. So raise public awareness of how terrorists behave. What are the red flags? What are things we should be looking out for? What are the ways that we see in our threat assessments, our situational awareness? If you see something, say something, those kinds of campaigns. That digital literacy, if you see something online and it makes you upset, is it real? Is it true? Okay, what are some of the different ways and some of the different things that we can use to help educate our individuals and help educate our public to make them better citizens and better aware of what's going on around them? If you see propaganda that's been placed out there by a foreign government, Russia, for example, in one of our elections, or anyone else that posts things out there that are not actually true, can you go out and actually find that information? So a lot of you in our classes, we encourage you, or sometimes require you, to go out and find references from different types of websites, and we'll show you different versions of the same news story so you can understand different perspectives of the same story. Same thing here. All right. Oops. So for cyber terrorism, this is a relatively new definition. Okay, we are still in the early stages of seeing what cyber terrorism looks like. But basically, you are using computer networks to cause physical damage. So it's not been very long ago that we proved that you can use computer networks and you can use computer code to cause physical damage. That was the Stuxnet virus, which was used to cause massive damage to an Iranian enrichment facility. And we've proven that this can work. And over the last few years, we've seen different levels of cyber terrorism. It's a variant of cyber attacks. So it's just you take a normal attack and then you use it again for those political or ideological goals. So we see these cyber attacks and these cyber terror attacks. We've seen the elevation of cyber as a weapon in Russia's war in Ukraine. So both countries and their proxies waged all kinds of attacks against the other, taking down critical infrastructure, crippling hospitals, crippling school lines, turning off oil, turning off all the different elements of life in those countries. And we've seen the impacts, we've seen the death, we've seen the destruction and those kinds of things that happen. Some of the other attacks and the ways that we have been attacked in this country, we've seen oil refineries and distribution go offline. We've seen food distribution interrupted. And we've seen a lot of our other critical infrastructure attacked with these cyber attacks. So the escalation of attacks and methodologies, like I said, in the Russian-Ukrainian war, we're kind of watching some of this unfold in real time. Terror groups are appropriating these techniques to be used in their attacks, and the attribution of these things can be problematic. So trying to figure out who's doing it, why they're doing it, and what they're doing. And the last part is terrorism as a service. So we're seeing some groups that have specialized skill sets, shall we say, loaning their skills out to the highest bidder. So we have a group that wants to influence a policy, but doesn't know how to get there. They're not good at that type of attack. They're not good at destroying this thing or infecting something or whatever they're trying to do. And so we have other groups right now that are loaning their services out and hiring their services out to commit those acts on behalf of someone else, making tracking and combating those things even more difficult. So, all right. Is your question from right here? Okay. Apologies, I was trying to wrap up as quickly as I could because I know we're about out of time. Questions from the group? Yes, no? Have all of our other panelists up here? Questions, comments? That's it. All right, thank you all for coming.
There's a sign-in sheet, people that did not sign in, would like to sign in. Sign-in sheet right here, there's one right on the stage here.
Thank you all for coming. That was really good. Sorry, I tried to wrap that quickly again. Appreciate it, sir.
I literally just got